The first shift you notice. At first, you think you're imagining it. Nothing obvious has changed. No conversations ended, no doors slammed shut. You didn't say anything differently. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't ask for more space. And yet, something feels different in the air. You notice it in the pauses. They last a little longer now, just long enough to feel them. In the way someone responds a second later than before. In the absence of a warmth that used to arrive automatically. Not gone, just delayed. You replay moments in your head quietly, not to blame yourself, but to check. Did I say something wrong? Did I miss a cue? Did I change something without realizing it? And the strange part is, you can't find the mistake, because there wasn't one. What changed wasn't your behavior. It was your inner position. You stopped shrinking, not consciously, not defiantly. You just stopped preparing yourself to be easier to be around. And when that preparation disappears, people feel it, even if they can't name it. The room doesn't reject you, it adjusts. And that adjustment feels colder than you expected. You begin to realize something unsettling. Some forms of closeness were built on how much of yourself you held back. Not because anyone was cruel, not because they wanted to take something from you, but because they learned to meet you where you were willing to disappear. And now you're still kind, still present, still quiet. But you're no longer absent inside yourself. That absence used to do a lot of work. It softened moments, it smoothed tension, it made things feel light. Without it, everything becomes more honest and heavier. This is the first shift you notice. Not loss, not conflict, just the realization that being fully here changes the temperature of the room. And once you feel that, you understand something else too. Staying present with yourself isn't invisible. It has consequences. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones. The kind you feel before you're ready to talk about them. The loss no one prepared you for. This is the part people rarely name, not because it's dramatic, but because it's uncomfortable to admit. After you stop shrinking, after you notice the shift, there comes a quiet sense of loss. Not sudden, not sharp, more like something slowly slipping out of reach while you're still standing in the same place. You begin to realize that some forms of closeness were never unconditional. They were responsive. They responded to how little space you took, to how carefully you adjusted, to how predictably you made things easy. And when that effort fades, not intentionally, not rebelliously, the response changes too. Not everyone pulls away, but not everyone leans in either. What disappears first is the automatic warmth, the ease, the feeling of being welcomed without having to be fully present. You notice it in small ways, in conversations that don't flow as freely, in moments where your presence feels heavier, even though you haven't said more. You haven't become demanding, you haven't asked for attention. You've simply stopped pre-editing yourself before you arrive. And that creates a strange emptiness, because the love you felt before was real, but it was attached to a version of you that no longer exists. This is where confusion begins. You don't feel angry, you don't feel betrayed, you feel unsettled. Because the loss isn't about people leaving. It's about realizing what was actually holding certain connections together. Sometimes it wasn't who you were. It was who you were willing not to be. And seeing that clearly can feel like grief. Not dramatic grief, quiet grief. The kind you carry alone because it feels wrong to complain about love that never hurt you on purpose. You may find yourself missing the old closeness, even as you know you can't recreate it honestly. You can't unsee how much of yourself you removed to keep it alive. And that realization changes the meaning of warmth. What once felt like safety now feels conditional, not because others changed, but because you did. And this is where the story deepens. Because now the question isn't, why does this feel different? The question becomes, was I being loved or was I being accommodated? There is no accusation in this, no judgment, just clarity arriving slowly, layer by layer. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't disappear quietly. It stays, and it asks you to sit with what you've lost without rushing to replace it. The pull to become smaller again. This is where the pull begins. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It arrives quietly, almost kindly. After the loss settles, after the warmth no longer comes automatically, a familiar thought starts to form, not as regret, not as panic, more like a suggestion, a soft remembering. It reminds you of how easy things used to be, how little effort it took to belong, how natural it felt to soften yourself before anyone even noticed you were there. You remember the version of you who didn't take up much space, and how rarely she felt this kind of tension. Not because she was more at peace, but because she was less visible. And visibility, you're beginning to understand, has a cost. This is where the mind starts negotiating, not with others, with you. It asks quiet questions, the kind that sound reasonable. Maybe you didn't need to be this present. Maybe you could soften just a little. Maybe it wouldn't be such a betrayal to return to what worked. After all, no one asked you to change. No one demanded honesty. You chose it, and sometimes that choice feels heavy. You start noticing how easily you could slip back, how natural it would feel to smooth the edges again, to pause before expressing something real, to make yourself slightly easier to hold. It wouldn't even feel like lying. It would feel like relief. And that's what makes this part so dangerous. Because the temptation isn't to disappear completely. It's to disappear just enough to regain comfort, to feel welcomed again, to feel chosen without effort. You imagine it for a moment. The familiar rhythm, the predictable closeness, the ease of being liked without being fully known. And for a brief second, it feels tempting, not because you don't value yourself, but because you're tired of holding awareness, tired of feeling the subtle shifts in every interaction, tired of noticing what others never had to notice before. Awareness doesn't numb you, it sensitizes you. And sensitivity without resolution can feel like too much. This is where many people turn back. Not loudly, not consciously. They don't announce a retreat. They just soften again. They adjust. They return to the version of themselves that knows how to be loved easily. But something inside you hesitates now. Not because you're strong, not because you're certain, but because returning would require forgetting what you've already seen. And forgetting no longer comes naturally. You can imagine the comfort, but you can also feel the cost. You remember how that version of you had to stay alert, how she monitored herself constantly, how she measured her presence instead of inhabiting it. And even though she was loved, she was never fully here. This is the moment where the choice isn't obvious. There is no clarity yet. No sense of direction, only this quiet tension between the ease of being smaller and the truth of being present. You don't resolve it here. You don't decide anything. You simply stay long enough to feel both sides fully, and that alone changes the story. The kind of strength that doesn't look like strength. This is where something unfamiliar begins to form, not relief, not confidence, something quieter. After you don't go back, after you stay with the discomfort long enough without fixing it, you start to notice a different sensation. Not certainty, but steadiness. It doesn't arrive as a decision. It doesn't say, this is who I am now. It feels more like weight settling. You realize you're no longer scanning yourself constantly, no longer checking how you're being received every second you exist in a space. You're still aware, still sensitive, but the urgency has softened. You're not trying to prove that you deserve to be here. You're not trying to justify your presence. You're just here. And that feels strange at first, because for a long time, your sense of safety came from effort, from adjusting, from anticipating, from making sure nothing about you became inconvenient. Now that effort isn't happening automatically, not because you're resisting it, but because something inside you no longer responds to that reflex. This is not empowerment. It doesn't feel powerful. It feels grounded. You notice that when silence appears, you don't rush to fill it. When tension shows up, you don't immediately smooth it away. Not out of defiance, out of presence. You're learning how to remain without managing the emotional environment. And that is a different kind of strength. One that doesn't expand outward. One that doesn't need to be seen. It works inward. You start to trust that you can stay with yourself even when the room feels unfamiliar, even when the response is slower, even when warmth doesn't arrive on cue. You don't interpret that as failure anymore. You let it be information. You begin to understand something subtle. Strength isn't the absence of discomfort. It's the ability to remain intact while discomfort exists. This doesn't make interactions easier, but it makes you steadier. You stop bracing for rejection before it happens. You stop preemptively leaving so you won't feel the shift. You allow yourself to be present even when the outcome is uncertain. And that changes the internal rhythm of your life. You move more slowly now, not because you're unsure, but because you're no longer running ahead of yourself. You listen longer. You pause without apologizing. You don't rush to explain what you haven't fully lived yet. This isn't the end of fear, but it is the end of panic. And in that space, something begins to take root. Not confidence, integrity, the quiet kind. When relationships start to reorganize, you don't announce this shift to anyone. There's no conversation where you explain who you've become, no moment where you redefine the rules. And yet, relationships begin to reorganize themselves, not dramatically, quietly. You notice it in how some people lean in a little more slowly, in how others seem unsure where to place you now. Nothing hostile happens, nothing obvious breaks, but the familiar choreography is gone. The timing feels different, the expectations feel less automatic, the roles don't fit the way they used to. This can feel disorienting because for a long time, connection meant knowing exactly how to show up, knowing what was needed, knowing how to adjust, knowing how to keep things flowing smoothly. Now you're still present, but you're no longer arranging yourself around what keeps others comfortable. And that absence of adjustment changes the shape of closeness. Some people respond with curiosity. They start paying attention in a new way. Others respond with distance, not because you hurt them, but because the version of you they related to is no longer available. This is where another quiet grief can appear. Not grief for people themselves, but for the ease that once existed. You may notice yourself missing how effortless certain connections felt, not because they were deeper, but because they required less honesty. And here's the part that feels unsettling. You didn't take anything away. You simply stopped compensating. You stopped filling gaps that weren't yours to fill. You stopped carrying emotional weight that didn't belong to you. And without that compensation, the true structure of relationships becomes visible. This visibility can feel lonely, not because you're alone, but because you're seeing things clearly for the first time. You begin to understand something important. Not every connection was meant to survive your full presence. And that doesn't mean those connections were false. It means they were built on a version of you that was always temporary. This realization doesn't make you bitter. It makes you quieter. You stop forcing continuity where evolution is happening. You let people respond however they respond, not because you don't care, but because you're no longer negotiating your right to exist as you are. This is where relationships stop being managed and start being revealed. And revelation, while painful, is also precise. It shows you what meets you when you stop meeting everyone halfway alone. Staying when the old world no longer responds. There is a moment that doesn't get talked about much. It comes after the internal shift, after the first quiet reorganization of relationships, after you stop explaining yourself. It's the moment where you realize that the world hasn't caught up to you yet. You are already standing differently inside, but the environment still speaks to you as if nothing has changed. The old expectations remain. The old projections linger. People still reach for the version of you that used to respond automatically. And this is where many people turn back. Not because they want to, but because staying feels harder than returning. There is a temptation here to soften again, to adjust just enough, to make things flow the way they used to. Not fully, just enough to avoid the friction. And the friction is real. It lives in the silence after you don't answer right away, in the pauses where you used to smooth things over, in the moments where someone waits for you to carry what you no longer carry. This phase can feel strangely exposed. You're not performing anymore, but you're also not yet mirrored back. There's no applause, no confirmation, no clear signal that this new way of being is working. Just space. And space can feel unsettling when you're not used to being met there. What's happening here is subtle but crucial. You're learning how to stay without reinforcement, without external validation, without relational reassurance. You're discovering whether your grounding belongs to you or whether it still depends on how others respond. This is not a test of strength. It's a test of orientation. Can you remain present even when the familiar feedback loops are gone? Can you tolerate the ambiguity of not being immediately understood? Can you resist the urge to translate yourself back into something easier to digest? This is where the transformation either deepens or quietly dissolves, not through drama, through patience. You begin to notice something else during this time. Your nervous system starts to settle in a new way, not because life is calmer, but because you are no longer bracing for constant adjustment. There is less internal scanning, less anticipation, less silent preparation to manage outcomes. You are not detached, you are anchored, and anchoring changes how time feels. Moments slow down, reactions soften, silence stops feeling like danger. You don't rush to fill it, you let it exist. And in that stillness, something unexpected happens. The world starts to respond differently, but only after you stop watching for it. Not all at once, not dramatically, one interaction at a time. Someone meets you without pulling. Someone listens without expecting you to lead. Someone stays present without requiring you to disappear. These moments are small, but they are precise. They don't recreate the old world. They confirm that a new one is forming. Not around effort, but around truth. And this is where the series truly shifts. Because what comes next is not about holding your ground anymore. It's about what becomes possible when you no longer build yourself against resistance. When the new becomes real. At some point, something quietly settles, not with relief, not with celebration, but with a deep, almost physical sense of alignment. You notice it in the way your body responds to situations that used to trigger immediate reaction. There is still awareness, still sensitivity, but there is no collapse. You are not holding yourself together anymore. You are standing. And this is where many people misunderstand what has happened. From the outside, it might look like distance, like withdrawal, like you've become harder to reach. But inside, the opposite is true. There is more contact now, just not the kind that costs you yourself. You are no longer negotiating your presence. You are no longer pre-adjusting your tone. You are no longer translating your boundaries into apologies. And something important becomes clear here. This version of you is not fragile. It doesn't need to be protected by constant explanation. It doesn't need to be defended. It doesn't need to be justified. It simply exists. That realization changes the emotional landscape. You stop checking whether you're too much. You stop wondering whether you came across the wrong way. You stop replaying conversations looking for where you might have overstepped. Not because you've stopped caring, but because you've stopped doubting your right to be here. And with that, a new kind of relationship with others begins to form. Some connections naturally loosen, not dramatically, just quietly, without tension. Others deepen, not because you worked on them, but because they no longer rely on you shrinking. What remains feels different, slower, clearer, more honest. You don't have to perform intimacy anymore. You don't have to maintain emotional availability at the expense of your own grounding. There is space now for mutual presence. And perhaps the most unexpected shift happens internally. You begin to trust yourself, not in a motivational sense, not as a belief or affirmation, but as a lived experience. You trust that you will notice when something isn't right. You trust that you'll respond instead of react. You trust that you won't abandon yourself just to keep something intact. This trust doesn't make life easier. It makes it realer. And real life doesn't require constant self-correction. It requires presence. You haven't become someone new. You've returned to someone who no longer disappears. And once that happens, there is no real way back. Because even if you tried, your system would recognize the costs immediately. This isn't a phase. It's a point of no return. What comes after you stop disappearing? There is a question that naturally follows this moment. It often arrives quietly, almost as a whisper beneath the surface. If I no longer disappear, what am I actually here for? When you stop organizing your life around emotional survival, a new space opens, not filled with answers, but with possibility. You begin to sense that your presence itself has weight, that your attention matters, that your choices shape something beyond adaptation. And this can feel unfamiliar, because for a long time your energy went into staying acceptable, into staying manageable, into staying safe inside other people's expectations. Now that energy is free, and free energy always asks to be directed. This is where the next movement begins. Not about fixing, not about healing, but about claiming. Claiming your inner orientation, claiming your emotional authority, claiming the right to shape a life that doesn't require self-erasure to function. The next chapter isn't about who you were. It's about what starts to emerge when you finally stay. And that is where we're going next.